Menachem Begin first entered my mind and my imagination, looking like a Haredi Jew. I was a teenager and I had acquired a copy of Begin's memoir, The Revolt. And as one does, I began by looking at the photographs that occupied the center of the volume. There I saw a photograph of Begin bedecked in a black hat with a long beard, a rabbi looking out at me. This because when Begin arrived in Mandate Palestine in the early 40s, he took on the leadership of the underground organization known colloquially as the Irgun, and speedily became the most wanted man in the British Mandate. As an alias, Begin became Yisrael Halperin in Petach Tikva, and then he grew a beard, moved to Tel Aviv, and became Yisrael Sassover, known in the neighborhood as a very pious man and a regular worshiper in the local shul in the synagogue. He writes in his memoir as follows, quote, "My beard and the status conferred on me also imposed certain obligations in my new surroundings. On the very first day, I was asked by Reb Simcha, the genial beadle, that's the Gabbai or Shamash of the nearby synagogue, to come along and make up the quorum at prayers in a house where a death had taken place. Immediately thereafter, I was invited to become a regular participant in prayers in the synagogue." Begin further tells us that, quote, "I used to attend regularly the lessons in Talmud and biblical commentaries given every Sabbath afternoon by the rabbi. And also," he writes, that, quote, "that gave me my regular place, and thenceforth I became one of them." Begin also adds, in perhaps the most humorous part of what is by and large a very serious book, that, quote, "I heard later in confidence that if the British had remained in Eretz Yisrael 10 years longer, I might possibly have risen to high eminence and been elected second assistant to the third warden of the synagogue." Now, ladies and gentlemen, suffice it to say that if, say, Moshe Dayan or Yitzhak Rabin or some other young Israeli had sought to seamlessly fit into the Orthodox community in Tel Aviv, I don't think they could have pulled it off. And the same could be said for Begin's Zionist inspiration, Zev Jabotinsky. Begin's fluidity with Jewish ritual actually almost got him into trouble. He recounted to Yehuda Avner the first Shabbat in his shtibel in the Hasidic quarter near Petach Tikva, in his shul. He told Avner that, quote, "On the first Shabbat they honored me as befits a newcomer by calling me up to the reading of the Torah. The Gabbai asked who he was. Believe it or not, he said, with a chuckle and a cheeky smile, I stumbled." He hesitated, in other words. According to the story, Yehuda Avner describes how Begin told him that the Gabbai gave him a suspicious stare. After all, who doesn't know how to identify himself? But Begin was instinctively going to respond with his Hebrew name, Menachem ben Zev Dov, which you give when you are called up to read to the Torah, as you do whenever you're a newcomer to a shtibel. And Begin said to Yehuda Avner, I had to remember not to give him my real name, but my Irgun name, not Menachem, but Yisrael. After that, I was always called to the Torah by that assumed name, and to this day, Begin concluded, I crave the Almighty's forgiveness for this deliberate misrepresentation in a holy place. There is in truth, I think, something fitting that my first image of Menachem Begin is as Yisrael Sassover, because that story and that identity testifies to his roots, to the city of his birth, which binds me to him. Brest-Litovsk, or as it was and is known to Jews, Brisk. There, in the Jewish community, Menachem Begin was taught Zionism by his parents. There he first heard Jabotinsky speak, spurring him to become ultimately the leader of the revisionist Zionist youth movement Beitar in Poland, and ultimately the leader of the revolt against the British. And it was in Brisk that the Nazis would murder his family and so many others that he held dear. But Begin's life as Yisrael Sassover was not entirely an alias, because Brisk was also where he was taught in his home, in his synagogue, by his friends and classmates, the virtues of the past, love of Judaism, and a covenantal connection to the generations gone by, and ultimately a reverence for the Torah and for faith itself. At a ceremony convened in 1972 by descendants of Brisk, 30 years to the day after the destruction of their city by the Nazis, Begin eulogized his childhood home by remembering how proud he and his fellow denizens were to be known as Briskers. He said that Kulanu hitga'inu bekach, sheyesh la ha'ir Brisk delita historia. We were also proud that this city Brisk of Lithuania had a history. Geonim adirei Torah, giants of Torah. Mi me'itanu, he said, who amongst us, lo ra'at atzmo, did not see himself, ki'ilu haya shutaf l'Rav Yoshe Ber l'Reb Chaim ke, ki'ilu anachnu hayinu imam kol yemei chayinu. Who did not see ourselves as if they were partners to the rabbinic leaders of Brisk, to Rabbi Yoshe Ber and to Rabbi Chaim, as if we were with them all the days of our life. And here Begin is making reference to my ancestors, Rabbi Joseph Ber and Rabbi Chaim Soloveichik, leaders of the community of Brisk, known for their Talmudic brilliance. Rabbi Chaim himself was renowned for creating a way of studying Talmud for which Begin's hometown would be forever known within Orthodoxy, the Brisker method. These rabbinic Soloveichiks were also known for their opposition to Zionism, a source of tension between the Soloveichiks and Begin's father, a leader of the Zionists in Brisk. So one might understand if, 30 years later in 1972, looking back on the memory of his murdered parents, Begin would have remembered the rabbinic leadership with some bitterness. But no. For him, the Soloveichiks are a source of pride. Indeed, he says that he considers himself a shutaf, a partner to their lives. Disagreeing with his childhood rabbis does not mean rejecting all that they embodied. On the contrary, he reveres them, he feels bound to them. And I, in turn, feel bound to Begin, my Brisker landsman. Menachem Begin is my hero, the man I believe to be the greatest Jewish statesman of the last many centuries. By this, I do not mean to say that he is the most important figure in the birth of the State of Israel. That honor would go to Herzl and then to Ben Gurion. Nor do I mean that he is the greatest statesman in recent history. Surely Lincoln and Churchill are claimants to that title. Nor do I mean that he is the greatest embodiment of living Judaism. That honor would go to specific rabbis I have in mind. But I do believe that Begin was the greatest Jewish statesman in a very long time. And by this I mean that no other individual so seamlessly combined the covenantal Jewish worldview of the past with his Zionist statesmanship in the present. And I believe that the key to this achievement, what set him apart from pretty much every other Zionist leader of his age, was his childhood home of Brisk. And Begin said so himself when asked if he would ever return to the city where his family and many, many thousands of Jews were murdered. He said, "No, I will not allow myself to go back to Brisk, yet Brisk will always follow me and be with me, because the three main things I have learnt were instilled in me in sorrow and also in joy that I have carried with me from my childhood home, with me during the nights of conflict and the days of joy. Here they are. 1. Love your fellow Jews. 2. Do not fear the Gentiles. 3. Lucky is the man who carries the yoke of his childhood with him." Today, utilizing Begin's writings and speeches as well as some of my own published reflections, drawing on some of my own published reflections about Begin in Mosaic and in commentary, I will reflect how these 3 lessons that he bore from Brisk defined his life and why ultimately they should define ours. The first Brisker lesson: love your fellow Jews. This Begin did indeed do. One of the striking aspects of Begin's speech is that he really spoke to his audience as Israelis. He would always say, when he was speaking to Jewish Israelis, he would say Yehudim, meaning Jews, or as some translated correctly, fellow Jews. Thus, when he was accused in 1981 during the election season by Shimon Peres of planning the strike on the Osirak reactor in Iraq to spur his own electoral success, he said as follows to the assembled crowd. He said, "Yehudim, atem makirim oti 40 shana. Ani garti bepetach tikva b'shchunat Chasidov. Fellow Jews, you have known me for 40 years from when I lived in the Chasidov quarter of Petach Tikva. Do you think," he said, "that I would risk the lives of pilots, leman bechirot, for elections?" And by the way, feel free to send me an email telling me how amazing my imitation of Menachem Begin is, because it is amazing. If you think it's not good, don't email me. That is the phrase he used, Yehudim. When he was elected in 1977 and asked Be'ez Signon in what style he would conduct his administration, he immediately responded, briefly and simply, B'signon Yehudi Tov, in the style of a good Jew. For Begin, central to his identity was being a Yehudi. And as my grandfather once homiletically said, we Jews nowadays, no matter what biblical tribe we may have come from, all call ourselves Yehudim, descendants of Judah, because it is Judah who originally united the Jewish people after the sin of the kidnapping of Joseph, when in Egypt he stood before the vizier that was his brother in disguise, and when the vizier sought to claim his baby brother Benjamin as his slave, Judah stepped forward and said, take me instead. To be a Yehudi is to be bound up in a familial faith in which we are responsible. By its very name, it implies responsibility for others and our boundedness with others. And this lay at the core of Menachem Begin's worldview. And we can find when this worldview matured and fully came to be. In his memoir, White Nights, describing his time spent in the Soviet prison of Lukishki, arrested for the quote-unquote crime of Zionism, Begin became friends with two Gentile cellmates who confessed to him that their deepest desire was that Germany attack the Soviet Union. Then they would be released to fight for Poland. And this is actually what happened in the end. Now, Begin also wanted to be released, but he knew what would happen if the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union. That multitudes of Jews and Jewish communities would be at the mercy of the Nazi hordes. And so Begin told them, quote, I can't forget that in the event of a Russo-German war, more millions of Jews are likely to fall into the hands of Hitler. I am not praying, he said, for a war between Germany and Russia. That's what he added at the end. He had a whole long discussion. And then Begin writes, the reply of the prisoners was an explosion of wrath. What you have just said, one of them said, is most characteristic. With you people, everything is decided according to one criterion. What is good for the Jews? Actually, this prisoner said, I was told long ago that there is solidarity among all Jews, but you have given me confirmation that you people guard your solidarity under all circumstances, even in prison. Begin, hearing this, writes that he reflected at that moment as follows. What was there for me to reply to their contentions? They both spoke of Jewish solidarity as if it were a crime, as if they were talking about a conspiracy, something evil. For heaven's sake, Begin wrote, what have the Jews not done to prove that they do not stick together? The divisions among the Jews, the multiplicity of their parties and their trends are proverbial. And all, Begin concluded, all to no purpose. The fictitious Jewish solidarity exists and will always exist in the minds of others. And if this is the case, I asked myself, writes Begin, has the time not come to strip it of the slur of a crime, the accusation of a conspiracy? Is our fate not unique? And is it not common to all of us Jews? Has not the time come to convert Jewish solidarity from a Gentile myth into a Jewish reality? This was the core of Begin's being, solidarity with Jews around the world. The revolt against the British by Begin can only be understood in this context. It was launched not in the name of the Jews who were already in Mandate Palestine, but rather in the name of the Jews around the world that in Begin's view the British had betrayed. Begin believed that the doomed Jews of Europe were denied entry into Palestine by the British because their being stuck in Europe and their ultimate death in Europe served British purposes. This way, the British could fulfill their promise to provide some form of a home in the Middle East for Jews, as promised in the Balfour Declaration, without there being that many Jews to actually fill it. In their name, in the name of those Jews around the world who were betrayed, Begin launched, who he believed had been betrayed, Begin launched a revolution. Only if you believe that the Jews are one people and bound up with one another does Begin's argument for revolt actually become understandable. But if Begin believed in the unity of the Jewish people as a sacred principle against all else, the same could not be said for his political opponents. And that is what set the stage for his greatest achievement. In June of 1948, the Irgun ship known as the Altalena, which is a pen name used by Vladimir Jabotinsky, came ashore at Kfar Vitkin, bearing badly needed arms and ammunition for the fledgling Jewish state. A disagreement ensued between Begin and Ben-Gurion as to the allocation of the arms, with Begin asking that 20% be allocated for Irgun forces in Jerusalem. With the Israeli Defense Forces surrounding the ship, a boy assisting on the unloading of its cargo fretted that those who had just come ashore from the ship might be fired upon. Begin assured him that this was inconceivable, that whatever happened, Jews do not shoot at Jews, he said. And he was badly mistaken. A firefight broke out. The Altalena fled back to the Mediterranean, landing near what is now Tel Aviv's Frishman Beach on June 22nd with Begin on board the boat. There, David Ben-Gurion ordered the ship shelled, and in the end, 16 members of the Irgun were killed. Standing on the ship while it's being fired upon, with his dear friends dying around him, Begin ordered those aboard the Altalena not to fire back, declaring Milchemet Achim Li'olam Lo, never a war between brothers. And after leaving the smoldering Altalena with much of its arms lost forever, Begin went on the radio and again ordered his seething followers not to seek revenge. In other words, after wrongly predicting that Jews would never shoot at Jews, Begin now enunciated an even more extraordinary principle. The Jews should not shoot at Jews, even when those other Jews were shooting at them. This, as I argued in an article and commentary, this, I think, ensured the existence of Israel. The survival of the newly born state was anything other than assured, and shooting back, however self-justified the self-defense might have been, would have torn the people apart. Yehuda Avner quotes Begin explaining his motivation. He said, 20 centuries ago, we faced the bitter experience of the destruction of our Second Temple, the destruction of our capital, Jerusalem. And why? Because of our senseless hatred of each other, a hatred that led to civil war and to our utter ruin, B'chiyah l'dorot, a weeping for generations. This, I believe, formed truly Israel as a nation. And herein, ladies and gentlemen, lies a lesson. Statesmen, leaders, great men of history are usually remembered for what they achieved, but often the greatest moments are found in what they chose not to do. George Washington was an extraordinary man, but his greatest achievement is, again, his refusal not to become king when he could have, resigning his commission. And this act was rightly understood by his enemy George III, who famously said, if Washington does that, if he just gives up power, then he will be the greatest man in the world. Similarly, Menachem Begin is rightly remembered for what he did. The Osirak strike, peace with Egypt, the rebellion against the British. Yet it is Begin's words on the Altalena, what he was asking his fellow Jews not to do. That was his greatest achievement. Begin himself, after retiring from political life, understood how central the Altalena was to his legacy, reflecting that he hoped to be remembered first and foremost for preventing civil war. This is an essential part of the founding of Israel. I've been criticized in the past by a historian whose work I greatly respect for referring to Menachem Begin as a founder of Israel. He was, according to this historian, too young for this title. But I do refer to Begin as a founder for several reasons, but first and foremost because Israel truly became a country at this moment. I consider it one of the most important moments in Israel's history. And it's therefore all the more tragic, as I argued in commentary, that precious little has been done to remember the events surrounding the Altalena. A small stone stands near Frishman Beach, bearing the names of the 16 dead, and emblazoned with Begin's declaration that never a war between brothers, Milchemet Achim Li'olam Lo. And nearby, bizarrely, is a cartoonish statue of Ben-Gurion standing on his head, one of the more popular photo sites in Tel Aviv. As the Jerusalem Post notes, quote, it's likely that few of the people taking selfies with the old man realize that right behind it is the site of one of the seminal events of Israel's early history. There have been several memorials made, but not at the site, not prominent enough at the site where it occurred. And in the end, the truest memorial to the Altalena, albeit only an implicit one, can be found at the grave of Menachem Begin himself. Because unlike previous prime ministers who were buried on Mount Herzl, or Ben-Gurion who chose to be interred on his farm in the Negev, Begin requested that he be buried on the Mount of Olives, next to the graves of Moshe Barzani and Meir Feinstein, two Jewish fighters who had blown up a grenade in a cell in 1947 right before they were about to be hung, embracing each other and dying together. I have visited those graves. I have visited those graves with reverence. But only this week did I learn another connection to Begin and to myself, which is that Meir Feinstein was born in the Old City, but his parents had made Aliyah from Brisk. They, too, were members of Begin's town, of Begin's community, and Begin's burial next to Meir Feinstein signaled his eternal connection between the world from which he came and the modern Israel that he helped create. But that is not the only reason why Begin sought to be buried there. For Begin, the fact that these two young men came from opposite ends of the earth, Barzani was an Iraqi Sephardi, Feinstein was an Ashkenazic Jew, and yet died in each other's arms, that embodied the fact that Jews are bound by blood, that too often that blood has been shed by our enemies, and that is why we must never shed it ourselves. And ultimately, that is why we must seek to love the Jewish people. This Begin made clear in 1981 in what is probably the greatest political speech ever given in Israel's electoral history. An Ashkenazi entertainer had referred to Begin's Sephardic supporters by an ethnic slur that meant riffraff, and he claimed that the Sephardic community served no heroic role in the IDF. Begin stood before his supporters, cited the tale of these two boys who had died together in British prison, the blood of their hearts joining one another. And he said, Feinstein haya mimotze Europei mashakorim Ashkenazi. Feinstein was an Ashkenazi Jew. Barzani haya Sepharadi me Iraq. Barzani was a Sephardic Jew from Iraq. And then he looks at the crowd and says, Ashkenazi? Iraqi? Yehudim! Achim! Lochamim! Jews! Brothers! Warriors! This is lesson 1 from Brisk. Love the Jewish people. Then there is the second lesson, one he learned from his father. Do not fear the Gentiles. In May of 1981, during this election season, in a meeting with American Jews, Begin was asked what he thought the lesson of the Holocaust was. Part of his answer was as follows. He replied, First, if an enemy of our people says he seeks to destroy us, believe him. Don't doubt him for a moment. Don't make light of it. Do all in your power to deny him the means of carrying out his satanic intent. Second, he said, when a Jew anywhere is threatened or under attack, do all in your power to come to his aid. Never pause to wonder what the world will think or say. The world, said Begin, the world will never pity slaughtered Jews. The world may not necessarily like the fighting Jew, but the world will have to take account of him. These American Jews speaking to Begin had no idea what Begin was planning when he said these words, and some 2 weeks later he would order one of the most audacious strikes in history on Osirak, preventing Saddam Hussein from acquiring nuclear weapons. Everyone, including the Reagan administration, criticized him at the time. Begin was indeed the fighting Jew, and the world certainly did not like him. As I described in this month's column and commentary, Time magazine helpfully informed its readership that the name Begin, quote, rhymes with Fagin. That's the anti-Semitic character in Oliver Twist. And American Jewry in 1981 was told repeatedly that they must choose between Reagan and Begin. But Begin, to paraphrase his own words, never paused to wonder what the world would say, and the world did indeed have to take account of him. Interestingly, Menachem Begin's greatest defender around this moment was, of all people, Bob Dylan, who, in 1983, toward the end of Begin's administration, penned a song called Neighborhood Bully, in which he sarcastically described how Israel is talked about by those who hate it. It happens to be the most Zionist song in the history of rock and roll. And here is what Dylan said, in part referring clearly to Osirak. Neighborhood bully just lives to survive. He's criticized and condemned for being alive. He's not supposed to fight back. He's supposed to have thick skin. He's supposed to lay down and die when his door is kicked in. He's the neighborhood bully. And then Dylan adds, he destroyed a bomb factory. Nobody was glad. The bombs were meant for him. He was supposed to feel bad. He's the neighborhood bully. And while I do an excellent Menachem Begin impression, I'm not even going to try a Bob Dylan impression, ladies and gentlemen. This song, Neighborhood Bully, is clearly about Israel, but it could be in its defense of Israel, in its stalwart, sarcastic defense of Israel. It could be a song about Begin himself, because his enemies around the world denounced him as a neighborhood bully when he was anything But, and even in Israel, his political opponents saw a contradiction between the man who made war against the British on behalf of his people and the man who made peace with Egypt on behalf of his people. Right before Begin left for Oslo to receive the Nobel Prize following the Camp David Accords, Golda Meir caustically remarked that, quote, Begin did not deserve a Nobel Prize, he deserved an Oscar, meaning that it was all an act, that Begin, in her view, did not truly seek peace. But Begin's deep insight, as he made clear at the Nobel, is the opposite, that this was not a contradiction in his character at all, that often it is strength on behalf of one's people that leads to peace. By the time Begin had arrived in Norway, Golda Meir had died, and Begin, gentleman as he always was, began by celebrating his predecessor, saying, I asked for permission to pay tribute to Golda Meir, a great leader and prime minister who strove with all her heart to achieve peace between Israel and her neighbors. And then Begin addressed the virtue for which he was being awarded, peace. It was the Jews, Begin noted, in Oslo, who first bestowed the very notion of peace upon the world. He said, the ancient Jewish people gave the world the vision of eternal peace, of universal disarmament, of abolishing the teaching and learning of war. Two prophets, Yeshayahu ben Amoz and Micha HaMorashti, having foreseen the spiritual unity of man under God with his word coming forth from Jerusalem, gave the nations of the world the following vision expressed in identical terms. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Begin then added his own small reflection on peace. He said, despite the tragedies and disappointments of the past, we must never forsake that vision, that human dream, that unshakable faith. Peace is the beauty of life. It is sunshine. It is the smile of a child, the love of a mother, the joy of a father, the togetherness of a family. It is the advancement of man, the victory of a just cause, the triumph of truth. Peace, said Begin, is all these and more. Begin, of course, understood as he said those words that those assembled in Oslo at the auditorium did not necessarily see him as a man of peace. They saw him as a fighter. And he therefore reminded them implicitly of the fact that he, Begin, who had just said that peace is the smile of a child, the love of a mother, the joy of a father, the togetherness of a family, that he himself had had his own family destroyed, his father and mother murdered, and that the world had done nothing to stop it, and that this had taught him that at times evil had to be fought before peace was possible. He said, in part, quote, but in my generation, ladies and gentlemen, there was a time indescribable. 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, a number larger than many a nation in Europe, were dragged to a wanton death and slaughtered methodically in the heart of the civilized continent. Other than a few famous and unforgettable exceptions, he said, they were left alone to face the destroyer. At such a time, unheard of since the first generation, the hour struck to rise and fight for the dignity of man, for survival, for liberty, for every value of the human image a man has been endowed with by his Creator, for every known inalienable right he stands for and lives for. Indeed, Begin added, there are days when to fight for a cause so absolutely just is the highest human command. Norway has known such days, said Begin, and so have we. Only in honoring that command comes the regeneration of the concept of peace. End quote. Let it, however, be declared and known, he added, that fighters for freedom hate war. Begin was dismissed by Jews and non-Jews as a man of war. But what he showed in his life was that only a fighting Jew who loves the Jewish people and does not fear the Gentiles, that can be the one who is best able to ultimately, after fighting, seek peace with the world. So those are our first two lessons. Love the Jewish people. Do not fear the Gentiles. And finally, and most importantly, the third lesson of Brisk. Lucky is he who bears the yoke of his childhood with him. Those are the three lessons Begin said he learned from Brisk. From the moment of Israel's birth, Begin stressed that the values of Jewish tradition, the values that he imbibed in Brisk as a child, must be part of Israel's public life. And that Israel must do so because Those Israeli Jews owed it to all the faithful Jews of the past who died, but whose spirits were very much present in that state, which embodied the fulfillment of their most ardent yearnings. Thus, one day after Ben-Gurion declared independence, the next night after Shabbat, the leader of the Irgun emerged from hiding. Over the radio, he announced that the revolt was over, that his organization would become part of the National Army. And the radio address that he gave is noteworthy because of its contrast to the words of the Israeli declaration that were pronounced the previous day. Rather than eliding the existence of God, as the declaration did, Begin began his address with the traditional Shechianu, thanking God for allowing them to reach this momentous hour. Begin echoed the phrase Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, the intentionally ambiguous locution used in the declaration, but he enlarged it to acknowledge the Tzur Yisrael V'Goalo, the Rock of Israel and its Redeemer. And whereas Israel's declaration only cited the Holocaust as further proof of Israel's necessity, Begin spoke of his murdered family and community as beacons and pole stars who lived alongside those who now fought for the Jewish people's resurrection. Begin said, as I wrote in Mosaic, I call Begin's worldview Covenantal Zionism. And what I mean by that is that Begin melded Jabotinsky's worldview with an encompassing approach to Jewish history that differed profoundly from that of many other Zionist leaders. The covenant of Israel, Moses taught, embraces et asher yeshno po imanu hayom et asher eineno po imanu hayom, those who are here today and those who are not here today. One cannot live as a Jew if one is not in communion with past and posterity. And Menachem Begin rightly rejected the predilection of the labor Zionist elite for amputating 2,000 years of exilic existence from Israeli identity. Begin understood that the battle for Jewish independence must be waged with a feeling of gratitude to those who had come before, and especially to those who had been murdered, the Jews who died with dreams deferred. Thus, Menachem Begin revered Zev Jabotinsky, and he even referred to him by the traditional Jewish term, Mori v'Rabbi, my master and teacher. And yet, in their approach to tradition, they were very different. Jabotinsky, in a famous letter to Ben-Gurion about how much he desired a Jewish state, once wrote with what can charitably be described as a lack of reverence for the everyday traditions of diaspora Jews. Jabotinsky wrote, quote, I can vouch for there being a type of Zionist who doesn't care what kind of society our state will have. I'm that person. If I were to know that the only way to a state was via socialism, or even that this would hasten it by a generation, I'd welcome it. More than that, added Jabotinsky, give me a religiously orthodox state in which I would be forced to eat gefilte fish all day long, but only if there were no other way, and I'll take it. That's what he wrote. In other words, for Jabotinsky, to achieve Zionism's ultimate goals, he would even eat gefilte fish, but only as a last resort. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like for a moment just to add that as extraordinary as Jabotinsky was, I will never, ever forgive him for this outrageous attack on gefilte fish, which I very much enjoy. This magical fish that somehow, we know not how, swims in the sea and yet nevertheless manages to keep a carrot on its back and delights us at our weekly Kiddush. But in all seriousness, Begin revered Jabotinsky, and there is much about Jabotinsky to revere, but he could never have written these words. Indeed, when the man known as Yisrael Sassover had a baby, when his wife had a baby, Begin actually hosted a Kiddush at the shul, with the members of the Irgun, unbeknownst to the synagogue, being the ones who were the sponsors, who were providing the food. As he puts it in his memoir, quote, we decided to do it as prescribed by tradition. On the Sabbath at the synagogue, I was overwhelmed with the warmth of congratulations, and I was deeply grateful to these good people who shared my joy in my isolation. The celebration, writes Begin, describing the Kiddush for his daughter, the celebration went off splendidly. Everything had been prepared. The faithful underground had not forgotten even the sliced salt herring spiked on cocktail sticks. And everybody told me, Begin wrote, that there had never been such a well-managed party in their synagogue. Thus did Yisrael Sassover, rightly, though unknown, the most wanted man in the entire country, host a Kiddush at the shul for his daughter, a Kiddush sponsored by the Irgun. This may seem a small matter, ladies and gentlemen, but it is not. The link to the past must impact and even define the present. A Jewish state ashamed of its ancestors, of its heritage, unwilling to reflect it in its culture and public life, is not a truly Jewish state, not truly in communion with those who have come before. Begin never sought a strictly Orthodox state that forced people to observe Jewish laws in their lives or that forced people to eat gefilte fish. But he did seek cultural communion. The one who has most lyrically described this aspect of Begin's life is Yehuda Avner, a very religious Jew who served several prime ministers, but ultimately in Begin found a kindred spirit. Begin, Avner tells us in his book, was not totally observant in his private life, but he believed very strongly that Shabbat was the glory of the Jewish heritage. Thus, when Sadat offered to come to Israel on Saturday, a huge moment that Israel had been awaiting for decades, Begin insisted that he not come till Saturday night, late enough so that preparations could begin after Shabbat. And in the Knesset he explained, he said, quote, "I wanted the whole world to know that ours is a Jewish state which honors the Sabbath day. I read again those eternal biblical verses, honor the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and was deeply moved by their meaning." These words echo one of the most sanctified ideas in the history of mankind. We ask all nations to respect our day of rest. They will do so, Begin said, only if we respect it ourselves. And as Avner further describes, one of the greatest fights that took place politically for Begin in the early 80s was when he insisted that El Al not fly on Shabbat. After threats were issued by the unions of El Al, he said as follows, "Let me say this to you, the good workers of El Al. The government has been the objects of threats from some of you if we go ahead with our decision. We disregard these threats. We cannot engage in profit and loss calculations when it comes to the eternal heritage of the Jewish people. There is no way of assessing the religious, national, social, historical, and ethical values of the Sabbath day by the yardstick of financial loss and gain." And he concluded, one need not be pious to accept the cherished principle of Shabbat. One merely needs to be a proud Jew. No other prime minister before him could make this case. And here too, one finds the source of Begin's valuing of religious life and tradition in Brisk. One finds it in a Jew who was able to pray as Yisrael Sassover, to be called to the Torah as Yisrael Sassover, because he had done so in Brisk as Menachem ben Ze'ev Dov. Hart Haston, an intimate of Begin, recalls being in the prime minister's office as 7 members of the Haredi political party stormed in angry about something or the other. Begin sat silently as they yelled, and then as they paused to catch their breath, he placidly looked at them and replied in Yiddish, "Nu, Rabboisai, hat schon gedaven mincha?" Gentlemen, did you already say the afternoon prayers? Stunned, they said, "No." So Begin, with Haston and his chief of staff, Yechiel Kadishai, formed a minyan, a quorum with their fellow Jews, whose rage by that point had dissipated. Begin knew how to daven, he knew how to pray, and he understood its power. And it was the prayers that he said in Brisk that he would never forget. And he recalled them when he made the case that we lose our understanding of what preserved the Jewish link to the Holy Land throughout the ages if we do not understand what it meant to pray 3 times a day to return to the Holy Land. In his 1972 eulogy, marking the annihilation of the Jews of Brisk by the Nazis, Begin spoke about the great synagogue of Brisk, the great synagogue of my great-great-grandfather, Rabbi Chaim Soloveichik. He described a school chum of his, Beryl Prager, son of the town Shochet, the slaughterer, to whom he would bring his family's kaparot, the chickens, before Yom Kippur. Again, these are references that no other Israeli prime minister could make. According to Begin, Beryl sang in the choir of the great synagogue with an angelic voice, or as he said, "Hayalo kol hakarui alt." He had a voice that was an alto. Ad hayom, until this day, Begin said, "Ani shomea et kol hatfilah shelo, o et tfilat kolo." I remember even now the voice of his prayer, or rather, said Begin, the prayer of his voice. And then Begin added the following about the synagogue, about its walls, about his father, and about all those within it. Uvitzaharei Yom HaKippurim, lo rabim od nisharu betoch kotlei Beit HaKnesset. On the afternoon of Yom Kippur, not many remained in the walls of the synagogue. Aval eila shenisharu oskim ba'avoda. But those who remained were reciting the avoda, the description of the service in the temple on the holiest of days. But my father demanded of me that specifically here I was obligated to stay and pray Ku'ulai Zohi Akdosha B'chol Tfilot Shel HaKadosh B'chol Yimot HaShana, because this was perhaps the holiest prayer that would be said. And Begin remembered V'kolo Shel HaChazan Mistalsel Yachadim Meshorim. Begin remembered how the cantor's voice merged with the choir as they described the sacred words of the prayer. V'kohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim b'azara kashayu shomim et Hashem ha'nechbad v'hanora ha'yu korim u'mishtachavim v'omrim baruch shem kavod malchuto li'olam va'ed. And the priests in the temple, when they heard the high priest say the Almighty's ineffable name, would fall and bow on their face. Barela sang those words, Begin recalled, and those assembled sang it, and he himself sang it. Ki'ilu hi tmol shalshom, as if what took place in the temple happened only yesterday. Herein lies the secret of Jerusalem as it lived in Begin's heart, and how it lives, Begin understood, in the heart of us all. Begin himself, paraphrasing Shai Agnon, commented that Brisk nachon mishom banu, from Brisk we came, aval noladnu b'Yerushalayim, but we were spiritually born in Jerusalem. Or to put it slightly differently, it was because Begin was raised in Brisk that he was born in Yerushalayim. Because in that synagogue in Brisk were to be found Jews who were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, so many others, standing together with their feet in Brisk but their souls in Jerusalem, saying with loyalty and longing the words of the Avoda v'hakohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara. And standing among them, looking upon his own father with so much love, praying with so much devotion, remembering a Jerusalem that once was and would be again, was a little boy who would one day become prime minister of his people, and would never forget where he once stood. And he would remind his countrymen again and again in his public life that honoring Zionism and its achievements means honoring those he had loved and lost. Because, as he himself said, the central lesson of his childhood from Brisk was, lucky is he who carries the yoke of his childhood with him. Begin, concluding his own eulogy for his family and for his murdered brethren, put it this way: Niskoret avatam kasher zachinu l'shichror Eretz Yisrael v'legulat Yerushalayim. We remember our ancestors' love as we have merited the freedom of the land of Israel and the redemption of Jerusalem. V'hakohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara, and the priests and the people who stood in the courtyard of the temple. Ze beruchenu hodot lavotenu, hodot lavatam et Eretz Yisrael. This is in our spirit, gratitude to our fathers, gratitude to their love of the land of Israel, gratitude for their prayers, gratitude to their faith in the coming of the Messiah. Hem lo zachu, he said, they did not merit to see redemption. B'neihem achareihem et atchalta dugula kovshu, but their children after them were able to acquire at least the dawn of deliverance. V'kach, he said, and thus, with avat Yisrael, with love of Israel, and with love for our forefathers, na'aleh nishmotehem b'ktushav ta'ara, we will raise their souls in holiness and purity. V'nasi b'libotenu et zecher avatam midor ledor, and we will carry in our hearts the memory of their love from generation to generation. This then, ladies and gentlemen, is the essence of covenantal Zionism. 3 lessons that Begin said he learned in Brisk. Love the Jewish people, do not fear the Gentiles, and above all, blessed is the boy, and fortunate is the man, who bears the yoke of his childhood with him. Begin's eulogy for Brisk reminds us of Israel's unique responsibility today to act to secure the safety of the Jewish people, but also to preserve the vision of those who had come before, those who had died before there was an Israel to protect them. If Israel fails to do so, not just to protect Jews, but to preserve the vision of the past, if for Israel the 2,000 years of persecution is merely a reminder that Jews need protection and nothing more, then the debt to the past is unpaid. But if the past vision is allowed to live, then those who died live as well. Today, for all of our manifold miracles, nevertheless, in a Jewish world that remains divided, we look again for a Jewish leader who can, in his or her own way, embrace the vision of Jabotinsky while still speaking with love and longing of Jerusalem, of past, present, and future. V'hakohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara. But there is, in the culture of Israel, something that gives me great hope. George Will once commented that even as America has a Washington Memorial, a Jefferson Memorial, a Mount Rushmore monument, but nothing for Alexander Hamilton, he said, if you want to see a monument for Hamilton in America, you just look around you. Because he said in his vision in America has triumphed. Whether this is true or not, the truth is that while there may be no adequate memorial for the Altalena, it is Begin's vision that ultimately lives in the Israel that exists today. We have in Israel a culture which is as much Sephardic as Ashkenazic, a culture that is very much a union of the two, a culture and a people and a country that is much more religious than most of Israel's early founders could have ever imagined. More than 40 years after a political rally, more than 40 years after an entertainer at a political rally referred to Mizrahi Sephardic Jews as riffraff, more than 70 years after Ben Gurion ordered the Altalena fired upon, more than 9 decades since a young boy sat next to his father on Yom Kippur in the synagogue in Brisk. In Israel today, one can find a Sephardic singer by the name of Yishai Ribo, one of the most famous entertainers in the land, singing in both clubs in Tel Aviv and to Haredi audiences. And his most popular song, the song that he has taught all Israel to sing, are the words of the Avoda, V'ya Kohanim v'ya Am ha'omdim ba'azara. One can see Menachem Begin's Israel, an Israel I believe that he helped found. And so I look back to Yisrael Halperin, Yisrael Sassover, Begin's many aliases, Begin himself as Yisrael being called to the Torah and being asked by the sexton his name. And then I think with shivers of awe what unfolds as his alias Yisrael is given, and the unsuspecting sexton says the words traditionally used to call up a man by the name of Yisrael to the Torah, but also, unintendedly, describing the rise of a state and of a figure who would lead that state. He would have said, Ya'amod Yisrael, arise, O Israel. So may it continue to rise, and may not only Israel but all Yehudim prove worthy of the legacy that Menachem Begin has given us.